Good morning. Welcome. My name is Greg Bertelsen. I am CEO of the Climate Leadership Council. I am delighted to be joined this morning by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Last week, Senator Whitehouse introduced the Clean Competition Act, and today he's joined us to share his thoughts on the legislation. And so, without further ado, let's jump right into the conversation. Senator Whitehouse, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I wondered if, just to get things started, you could briefly describe what the Clean Competition Act does and why you decided to introduce it.
Sure. First, thank you for naming this Climate Conversation series for Ted Halstead. It's a very nice gesture. I appreciate that. What the Clean Competition Act does is provide what we think will be a reciprocal for the United States to the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which they call the CBAM, C-B-A-M, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. The EU CBAM is coming at us. Every conversation I had in Dubai that related to the CBAM or the EU conveyed the same message, which is there's no going back, and they're not going to give the United States any waivers, exemptions, excuses, delays, or that. So we will either be shortly paying tariffs to the EU for the greater carbon intensity of products in certain carbon-intense industries, or we'll have to step up and pass a reciprocal law of our own that can obviate the tariff requirement. And this law is a model step forward to accomplish that. It also requires ultimately bipartisanship if we're going to get this done. And it also ultimately requires that the Biden administration take a position on the EU CBAM and on how it is going to respond. So it's a big foot forward into that conversation, which we're going to need to resolve fairly soon.
Thank you for that overview. A lot within that I want to dive into. Let me start staying with COP. You just got back in the last couple of days. I think likely the most well-attended COP ever. You introduced this bill on your way over or while you were already there. I'm curious, what was the reaction from some of the international partners that you spoke with about your legislation specifically?
Well, let's start by saying that when you step into COP land, you step into an arena of intentions and ambitions and pledges and commitments, none of which have had any effect to reduce either increasing methane emissions or concentration or the carbon concentration in our atmosphere. So it's a little bit of a strange world with its own terms and so forth. And in that world, you'd think that the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism would have had a much, much bigger role, because it actually will put a price on polluting globally. And if other nations join in, it amplifies that price signal. So it's actually a really big deal. I think the CBAM is a way bigger deal than the COP itself. So again, it's a little bit weird to go there, but there was attention to it. There was an entire presentation on it. And I think that for those who are aware of the CBAM, that sense that it's going to be inevitable, they're not going to budge, is extremely important and was emphasized. And I think there was some gratification that the U.S. is going forward trying to legislate to obviate the tariff. Obviously, the purpose of the exercise at the end of the day is not to raise tariff revenues from U.S. businesses. The purpose at the end of the day is to send a price signal about pollution so the pollution stops and our emissions stop going in the wrong direction. So when we step up to try to eliminate our tariff responsibilities by reducing our emissions, that is received with applause by the EU and by others who are counting on the CBAM for a positive effect.
Well, as you state, the purpose of this isn't to put a border mechanism in for the sake of putting a border mechanism in. The purpose of this approach is to lower global emissions. We've got the EU CBAM sort of the furthest along in development, but we've also seen several other G7 nations contemplate this kind of a policy. We've heard the UK is considering something along these lines. We've heard Japan is exploring some form of a carbon import fee adjustment. As you introduced your bill, as you think about this space a little bit more broadly, I mean, ultimately, is the objective to find some common cause here to drive towards cooperation, recognizing that we're all sort of operating in isolation a bit, but is there space for us to come together and form something that's a bit more cooperative?
Yes, there absolutely is. I think the Australians are putting in their own carbon pricing measure. It's a little bit on a slower schedule, so there'll probably have to be some adjustments made in order to have it come into balance as a fully reciprocal carbon price that entitles them to not pay the tariffs. Also, they trade way more with Asia than with Europe. Canada is keenly interested and has the carbon pricing already pretty much in place. So the tariffing piece is pretty easy. I think they're actually waiting for some kind of a signal of how their big southern brother is going to behave. The UK, it's been reported, is going to join, and they have considerable carbon pricing pre-Brexit that will get them a long way through the hard part. So again, it's mostly then about tariffing. And I note that the minister on the special parliamentary committee on climate economics, Philip Dunn, attended the COP, which I don't think he has done before. So that's another sign. And I spoke to the new foreign secretary, and he had a very positive general outlook about complying with the CBAM. So I think, you know, you could pretty easily end up with a lot of major economies, US, UK, EU, Canada, Australia, Japan, all aligned quite well, each operating in a tariff-free environment with the others, and collectively sending an enormous price signal down into industries and out to other economies that they need to step up.
I want to just ask one more question on the international stage, and then Senator Whitehouse, let's turn to the domestic conversation. But we've talked already about major economies starting to explore these kinds of policies. Obviously, there are implications for poorer nations. I know your bill has some considerations for least developed countries. I'm curious if that dynamic came up at all in your conversations, or how you've thought about addressing that issue of sort of the poorest countries as it relates to your legislation.
Yeah, I spoke about that on several occasions, and in a nutshell, the arguments are, first, the damage to the planet's basic natural operating systems that we are now inflicting, as it worsens, will fall far more heavily on less developed economies than it will on more developed economies, and on less wealthy people than on more wealthy people. So just preventing climate catastrophe is in and of itself an expression and an exercise of climate justice. Then you move on to the tariffs themselves and what they mean. First of all, as tariffs, they raise revenue, and that revenue can be used to help facilitate climate justice at the international level. But I think even more, it sends a very powerful price signal out into the marketplace for the development of renewable energy. And if you look at, say, a good deal of the global south, it has enormous capacity in solar and in wind, but it is off the grid from the more developed energy intense economies. So for instance, if you wanted to put together a massive solar field in the Western Sahara, a proper carbon price that sends a signal out into the economy that this will actually provides a profit motive and a revenue scenario. That makes it a lot easier to run an electric cable under the MEB to connect such a facility and provide significant revenues into the Sahel area. That's just one of many examples. But when you're starving renewable energy by allowing polluters to pollute for free, that has a pronounced effect on the development of renewable energy. And I think a good deal of the renewable energy that we stand to develop will be developed in the global south. It just needs to be hooked up from there.
Okay, let's switch gears a little. Let's talk about what's going on the domestic front, what's going on here in Washington. I mean, obviously, or to state the obvious, one of the most interesting things about this arena of policies is that we've seen some new entrants to the discussion. More specifically, we've seen Republican proposals for a pollution import fee. And you've obviously had a number of conversations with colleagues on both sides of the aisle broadly about climate and trade policies. Now, clearly, there are differences in the details. That is clear. But my first question is, at a high level, do you see alignment around objectives? Is there alignment around the high level objectives, lowering global emissions, boosting U.S. competitiveness, strengthening our geopolitical interest? At that level, do you see alignment, recognizing that at the details level, there are some differences?
Yeah, I think that natural alignment is there. I think it actually even goes beyond that. I'm not a huge substantive fan of the Cassidy-Graham bill per se, but I'm enormously happy and proud that they have filed their bill because now it creates the prospect for real bipartisanship. And I think it gives us the opportunity to work together towards a bipartisan bill. So while I may not agree with the technical aspects of the bill, I am thrilled that it exists. I think it's an extremely important step forward. And I think everyone who is interested in this issue needs to make sure that they're showing Senator Cassidy and Senator Graham their love and affection and appreciation for having taken this step. It was not easy. Another co-sponsor got blown off the bill by fossil fuel pressure within days. The Wall Street Journal editorial board pounced with a very hostile editorial. So it ain't easy for Cassidy and Graham to be standing by this bill. And I think it's important that those who seek to move in this direction make sure that Cassidy and Graham understand that they'll have their backs. I also think that there's an alignment coming on the corporate side. At the moment, the entire debate over climate change is completely dominated by the fossil fuel industry and its array of front groups through which it operates. And there is almost zero pushback from anywhere else in the corporate sector. Most trade associations are either complicit in the fossil fuel industry's obstruction or actually facilitating it and participating in the obstruction themselves. So it's not a good environment right now. But when the CBAM comes and when tariffs start to be applied, two things are true for American industry. One, the existence of the CBAM is good for them because the supply chains will move from China to the United States because of the relative lower carbon fee that we'll have to pay compared to China. So that's immediately a win in terms of supply chains and manufacturing and business development. And then we can make it an even bigger win if we can step up and obviate those businesses having to pay the tariff. So there's an alignment potentially with steel, aluminum, cement, pharma, chemistry, who can all get together and get behind these kinds of bills and either tell the fossil fuel industry to knock it off. They've been put up with their political behavior long enough, and that ends here, or simply roll them if the fossil fuel industry refuses to step back and allow this to happen.
Your point on there being this potential for broad alignment around this approach from a number of different industries resonates with me, and I obviously agree with you. I think that those who come to this space purely with an interest in lowering global emissions can find a lot in common with those who are interested in driving U.S. economic interest. You know, we spend so much time talking about Republicans entering the space. I think we can sometimes take for granted Democrats supporting these kinds of approaches. Not every member of Congress spends as much time as you, Senator, thinking about climate policy. And so I'm curious.
There's an understatement.
I'm curious how your conversations around this approach have gone with some of your Democratic colleagues. Obviously, you introduced this bill with a House partner, Susan Del Bene, introduced the House companion. Several Democratic sponsors in the Senate. But for those, again, who have been less involved, how have your early conversations with your Democratic colleagues been going?
Very positive. I think people see the logic and benefit of this. The more they understand that the CBAM is inevitable and that the EU is not going to budge, which was a very powerful lesson from Dubai, the more people understand that this is the time for it. We're getting very positive feedback from Senate leadership. And I think we're in about as good a position as we could be until the moment comes when steel, aluminum, cement, chemistry, and pharma begin to step into Congress and push for this in a serious way. One of the things that's going to be an interesting bellwether is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is perhaps my most inveterate adversary on all things climate. But they don't just represent the fossil fuel industry in real life. They also represent all 5 of those industries. And I think all 5 of those industries need to have a good, long, serious conversation with our friends at the Chamber to see if they can get them aligned around this type of methodology. And I think if they can, then that the road forward for the bill widens even more.
Oh, let's talk about that road forward in our final couple of minutes. 2024 is an election year, so we know just by that dynamic, it is often a challenging one for new legislation. There's challenging dynamics in both chambers. I'm curious about what progress looks like for you in the months and year ahead, and also for the supporters who have joined us today. How can they be helpful to you in advancing this bill forward?
Yeah, I think for those who are here on emissions reduction and who are part of the environmental community, that communicating to Democrat leadership in the House and Senate and to the White House, that this is important to them and that we need to step it up. I think that would be very helpful. I think for the business community to make sure that its trade associations are aligned with this direction is going to be very important. Most trade associations are sitting out the climate fight, and many of the ones that are not sitting out the climate fight are on the wrong side. And that's not a great place for the America's corporate community, because I think the corporate community has a rather different view of things than the trade association intermediaries that we have to deal with. So I think those things can make a very big difference going forward.
Well, Senator, I could chat with you a lot longer about this topic, but I know that you have a busy day ahead of you. In about 30 seconds, your staff is going to come and physically remove you from that chair. So I want to thank you so much for your time this morning, your work on this arena. I'll give you a chance to say a final word, and then we'll let you get on with the rest of your day.
Terrific. Well, the final word really is to thank you, Greg, and the Climate Leadership Council. What people may not know is that underneath the ducks floating together from the Democratic and Republican side are some very busy feet paddling very, very hard to bring us together. And the Climate Leadership Council has been very helpful, along with 2 very able technical firms, Resources for the Future and Silverado, which are building very significant intellectual infrastructure for our discussions so that they are less able to be steered off course and are more focused on genuine issues and enjoy a stronger bipartisan platform of fact. And I'd also single out the Bruegel group from the EU, which had such a good role in designing the CBAM and which is in touch with your network as well. I think that under kind of slightly hidden technical support is going to be extremely well rewarded in the future. Your investment in making that happen is much, much, much appreciated. And this isn't just a bunch of senators wandering into each other in the hallways and bloviating. There actually is very significant intellectual underpinnings that CLC has had a very important role in helping to create. So thank you for that. You make our work easier.
Well, thank you so much, Senator, for those kind words. And again, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We will let you get on with your day. And as the Senator signs off, I wanted to share just a few final thoughts. This is the Council's final climate and trade event for the year. And I mean, really, what a year it has been in this policy arena. We've seen multiple different climate and trade proposals here in the United States, the continued development of the EU CBAM, and as we just discussed, several other countries around the world exploring policies in this arena. And so I wanted to share just a couple of my takeaways from the year before we all get on with the rest of our day. First, climate and trade policy is a category of policies. It is not a single approach, which we've learned this year. And within this category of policies, the details and who supports them can vary quite a bit. Second, though, is that in the United States, there does seem to be alignment around the objectives. Again, at the high level, but still alignment around the objectives, which include lowering global emissions, boosting U.S. competitiveness, and strengthening our geopolitical interests. Now, the prioritization of those objectives can vary. I think it's fair to say that a Senator Whitehouse comes to this initially with an interest in lowering global emissions, while at the same time, we've seen some industry voices, some Republicans come to it first with a U.S. economic interest in mind, while still being committed to lowering global emissions. But it's that alignment around objectives that gives me a lot of optimism that there's room for bipartisanship down the road. Third, to meaningfully address climate change, we need to leverage trade policy. 25% of global emissions are associated with goods that are ultimately traded internationally. We need incentives at the inside or within the global marketplace that reward lower carbon production throughout. I think these policy approaches are absolutely an essential part of the suite of approaches that are needed to meaningfully and smartly address climate change. And finally, a lot of progress was made this year developing and exploring new policy ideas and approaches. You all played a big role in that. We brought a lot of new voices to this conversation, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that a lot of work lays ahead. A lot of work lays ahead in further developing these policy details, analyzing their impacts, and engaging new impacted stakeholders. So as we look ahead to next year, to 2024, we are really excited to continue working with you all, continuing to work with our friends on the Hill, in the administration, and ultimately doing our part to advance effective climate and trade policy. So on behalf of all of my colleagues at the Climate Leadership Council, I want to wish everyone the absolute best in the final days of this year. I want to wish you a very safe, restful, and happy holiday. And we look forward to getting back together, back to work with you all early in 2024. Thanks again.